For 3 days this mare attacked anyone who came near her newborn. When they finally understood why, no one could speak. For 3 days no one was allowed inside the shed. The mare stood there without rest, without food, without fear, guarding something she refused to show the world. People thought she was dangerous. They were wrong. She wasn't protecting her foal from humans. She was protecting it from what life was about to do to it. The spring thaw had turned Flathead Valley into a world of soft mud and silver mist. For 3 nights straight, the temperature hovered just above freezing, and the fog rolled in off the river like a living thing, curling around fence posts, swallowing the dark outlines of pines, muffling every familiar sound on the rescue ranch. Caleb Warren woke to a noise that didn't belong to ordinary night chores. It wasn't the steady nickering of horses shifting in their stalls, or the hollow rattle of a gate in the wind. This sound was sharp and broken, an urgent, strained whinny that sliced straight through the quiet, as if the darkness itself had cracked. He sat up, listening. Another cry followed, lower this time, threaded with pain. Caleb swung his legs off the bed and reached for his jeans and boots in one motion. The little cabin was cold, the kind of cold that lived in the wood and never fully left until June. As he pulled on his jacket, his hand brushed a stack of unopened mail on the table. Veterinary receipts, feed invoices, the kind of paperwork that came with keeping a place like this alive. He didn't look at it. Not now. Not at the reminder of budgets and ranch insurance and the way emergencies always arrived without warning, like storms. Outside, the air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. His flashlight beam cut a narrow tunnel through the fog as he jogged across the yard, boots splashing through shallow puddles. Somewhere near the back pasture, a mare cried again, the sound bouncing off the trees as if the forest was holding its breath. "Willow," he said under his breath, already knowing. Willow had come to the rescue ranch 6 months earlier. Skinny, skittish, ribs too visible beneath a dark bay coat, eyes too wide for a horse that had ever been treated gently. She'd been surrendered from a busted-up backyard breeding operation outside Missoula, along with 2 other mares and a gelding with a scarred shoulder. Caleb had spent weeks earning her trust, the slow way. Quiet presence, predictable movements, no sudden hands. Even now, she wasn't the kind of horse that leaned into affection. She tolerated it, the way someone might tolerate sunlight after living too long in a dim room. And she was overdue. 9 days by Hannah Moore's estimate. Caleb had been checking on her every few hours, like a man waiting on a phone call he didn't want to receive. He knew what it felt like to live in the shadow of a calendar and not trust it to tell the truth. After his wife died, it had been. Forms and dates and insurance letters that arrived with the same sterile certainty, none of them able to explain how a life could be gone while the world kept moving. Now, as he neared the birthing shed, Willow's voice rose again, the kind of sound that made his chest tighten. He slowed before he reached the doorway, forced his breathing to steady. He'd learned that horses noticed what people tried to hide. The shed was a rough wooden shelter with 3 sides and an open front, built to block the worst of the wind. Inside, the straw had been spread thick. Caleb swept his light across the floor, and for a moment the beam caught on something slick and dark near Willow's hind legs. The birth sac. Willow was down, heaving, her sides expanding and collapsing like bellows. Her coat was wet with sweat despite the cold. She lifted her head as Caleb appeared, and her eyes locked onto him, dark, shining, intense. Caleb stopped a dozen feet away. "It's okay," he murmured. "Easy, girl. You're doing fine." Willow's ears flicked back, not flat yet, but wary. Her breathing was harsh, the last waves of labor rolling through her body. Caleb kept his stance angled, not squared up like a challenge, but open enough to show he wasn't trapping her. The fog made the shed feel smaller, pressing in at the edges, turning everything into a tight little stage of straw and breath. Then, in the beam of his flashlight, something moved. A small shape, still half wrapped in the slick membrane, lay on the straw. One thin leg jerked, a shoulder twitched. The foal took a breath that sounded like a tiny gasp, like a match striking in the dark. Caleb didn't realize he'd been holding his own breath until he let it out in a slow, trembling exhale. "There you are," he whispered, more to himself than to Willow. Willow's head lowered immediately. She began to lick the foal with frantic, devoted strokes, pulling the sack away, clearing the nostrils, working as if she could scrub the world clean of danger by sheer will. Her body was exhausted, but something inside her was fierce and lit. Caleb stayed where he was. He knew the rule: give them space. Let the bond happen. Let the mare claim her baby in her own language before human hands tried to translate it. The foal's chest rose and fell, another breath, a faint, trembling attempt to lift its head. Caleb's throat tightened, not from cold, but from the sudden sharpness of relief. This was why he did the work, why he kept the rescue afloat even when the numbers didn't make sense, why he kept saying no to easier jobs with steadier paychecks and better benefits. Here, in a shed that smelled like straw and sweat, life kept choosing to arrive anyway. Willow licked harder, her muzzle nudging the foal's shoulder. The little one responded with a weak nicker, a sound so soft it barely carried. Caleb took one cautious step forward, just a step, nothing more, wanting to see if the foal was breathing clean, if its gums were pink, if it was alert enough to nurse. The first hours mattered. Hannah had explained it a dozen times. Colostrum wasn't just milk. It was protection, the newborn's first shield. Without it, tiny problems could become big ones fast, and then there were more bills, more decisions, more phone calls you didn't want to make. Willow's head snapped up. Her ears pinned flat, sudden and absolute. Her nostrils flared, and her whole body shifted, not just protective, but electric with alarm. In one swift motion, she pushed herself up off the straw. The foal rolled slightly with the movement, and Willow swung her body around, placing herself between Caleb and the newborn like a wall of muscle and instinct. Caleb froze. He'd seen mares guard their babies. He'd seen warnings. This was something else. Willow's eyes were wild, not angry, not cruel, but terrified in a way that made her look like she'd been dropped into a world that didn't make sense. She stepped forward, teeth bared, neck arched. A deep guttural sound rumbled in her throat, a threat so clear it needed no translation. Caleb lifted both hands slowly, palms open. "Okay," he said gently. "Okay, I'm backing up." He took one slow step back. Willow advanced, matching him, keeping her body perfectly aligned so the foal stayed hidden behind her chest and forelegs. Caleb's pulse hammered in his ears. He felt the irrational sting of personal insult, like she was rejecting him, like all the hours he'd spent earning her trust meant nothing. But he swallowed it down. This wasn't about him. It was about something Willow believed with her whole being. He backed up another step. Willow didn't relax. In the narrow beam of the flashlight, the foal made a tiny, wavering sound. Caleb caught only a glimpse of wet straw and the faint outline of a small shoulder. Willow shifted, blocking even that. Her gaze never left him. Caleb stopped moving and softened his voice until it was almost a breath. "Easy, Willow," he said. "I'm not here to take your baby." Caleb held his position in the wet grass just outside the shed, letting the silence stretch until Willow's breathing stopped sounding like a storm. The fog pressed in close, turning the flashlight beam into a pale cone that made Willow's eyes gleam like dark glass. She didn't charge. She didn't have to. Her stance alone was a warning carved into muscle and bone, a promise written in pinned ears, and a hard, fixed stare. So Caleb did the one thing that went against every instinct he had as a caretaker. He left. Not far, just far enough to tell Willow she still owned the space. He stepped backward until the shed opening was a rectangle of gray in the fog, and then he turned off the light. The darkness felt like a surrender, but it also felt like respect. He walked to the fence line, leaned against a post slick with moisture, and listened. Inside the shed, Willow shifted, straw rustling beneath. Her hooves. The foal made another small sound, thin, reedy, alive. Caleb's shoulders loosened a fraction. Alive was something. Alive meant there was still time. But time was exactly what worried him. He'd kept this rescue ranch afloat for years by knowing where to spend effort and where to save it. Hay in winter, vaccinations on schedule, strong gates, safe fencing. Every month had its own list of costs, the kind that never stopped even when donations slowed. He'd learned to keep a mental ledger the way other men kept prayers. A sick horse didn't just mean compassion. It meant phone calls, an emergency vet fee, a bill that arrived in a white envelope with no sympathy in the paper. And newborns. Newborns were fragile miracles with sharp edges. Caleb glanced toward the dark shape of the barn where the rest of the horses slept. Coyotes sometimes drifted near the far tree line, drawn by the smell of afterbirth. He'd seen their eyes before, 2 points of light beyond the fence, watching, waiting for weakness. Willow might sense them too, even if none were present. A mare's world was a map of danger most humans never learned to read. He stayed out there until the cold soaked through his jacket and the fog began to thin. Around 4 in the morning, the sky lightened from black to bruised purple. The first birds began to stir. The ranch felt like it was waking reluctantly, as if even the land was cautious about what it might find. When Caleb finally approached the shed again, he didn't do it like a man marching into a problem. He did it like someone entering a church. Slow, announced, no surprises. "Hey, Willow," he said softly, keeping his voice low and even. "Just me." Willow's head snapped up immediately. She was standing now, square over the spot where the foal lay hidden behind her front legs. Her coat was damp, her flanks still hollowed from labor. She looked like she'd aged 5 years overnight. The moment she saw Caleb, her ears flattened again, and she took one step forward that made the message unmistakable. Caleb stopped at the exact same distance as before. He didn't test her. He didn't bargain with her. He just breathed slowly and watched. He needed information, basic things. Was the foal trying to stand? Had it nursed? Was it shivering? Was Willow bleeding? 100 small questions crowded his mind, each one sharp with consequence. But Willow gave him no angles, no openings. She kept herself perfectly positioned to block any view of the newborn, as if she could erase it simply by refusing to let the world witness it. Caleb tried a different approach. He set a bucket of warm water just outside the shed entrance and then backed away. Willow didn't move. He slid a small pan of grain closer. Nothing fancy, just the feed she usually accepted. Willow didn't even glance at it. Her entire body was focused on one thing, guarding what was behind her. That wasn't normal. A hungry mare after foaling was usually a mare you could distract. Even anxious ones would flick an ear toward food, would step aside for a moment if their instincts allowed it. Willow's instincts weren't allowing anything. Caleb's jaw tightened. He felt the old frustration rise, the same familiar helplessness that used to appear when doctors spoke gently and nothing changed, when grief followed its own timetable and didn't care about logic. He shoved it down. This wasn't grief. This was a living animal making a choice that didn't make sense to him yet. He retreated again, walked to the barn office, and flipped on the small heater under the desk. The air inside smelled like paper and leather tack, like coffee that had been reheated too many times. On the wall was a whiteboard with appointments and reminders, worming schedules, farrier dates, a note about renewing the ranch insurance policy before the end of the month. Caleb stared at the board for a long second, then grabbed his phone. Hannah Moore answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Hannah," Caleb said quietly, keeping his words controlled. "It's Willow. She foaled overnight." There was a pause, then the soft click of Hannah waking fully. "Okay. How's the foal?" "That's the problem." Caleb rubbed his forehead with his free hand. "I don't know. Willow won't let me within 10 feet. Not protective. Aggressive, like she thinks I'm a threat." Silence hung between them, heavy and wary. "Has the foal nursed?" Hannah asked. "I can't tell. I can hear it sometimes. I saw it breathing. But I can't see its mouth, its chest. Nothing. Every time I try to get closer, Willow pins her ears and comes forward." Hannah exhaled slowly, the sound of a professional mind switching into the hard part of the job. "All right, don't push her. Not yet. A mare that panicked can accidentally hurt a foal, even trying to protect it." Caleb stared out the office window. The shed sat in a pocket of pale morning fog, quiet as a secret. "So I just wait?" "No," Hannah said, her voice firm now. "You monitor, from a distance. If the foal stands and nurses, that buys us time. If it doesn't, we'll need a plan. I can be there in a couple hours. I'll bring a portable ultrasound and a sedative, just in case." Caleb swallowed. Even hearing the word made his stomach knot. Sedation on a fresh mare was a gamble. It could fracture trust. It could create a new kind of fear that never quite left. But if the foal hadn't taken colostrum, the clock was already ticking in a way that didn't care about sentiment. "Bring what you need," Caleb said. "I'll keep watch." After the call ended, Caleb went back outside and sat on an overturned feed bucket near the barn wall, far enough that Willow wouldn't feel cornered, close enough that he could see movement if the foal came into the open. He kept his hands in his pockets to stop them from shaking in the cold, and he forced himself to become what Hannah had described, a steady, harmless presence. Minutes passed, then an hour. At one point, Willow lowered her head, not to eat, but to sniff the straw near her chest. Caleb's heart lurched. He leaned forward slightly, hoping, just hoping, to catch a glimpse of the foal's face. Willow's head snapped up again, ears pinned. A warning. Caleb leaned back, chastened. He stared at the wet ground instead, as if looking away could prove he wasn't hunting for anything. The irony cut deep. He was the one who had fed Willow, sheltered her, saved her from a life that had used her body like machinery. And now she stood between him and the newborn as if he were the danger she'd been running from all her life. But that was the cruel truth about trauma, human or animal. It didn't always recognize kindness when it saw it. Sometimes it only recognized patterns. Sometimes it only recognized fear. As the morning climbed, the ranch began to stir. A gelding in the barn banged his stall door. Birds called from the trees. Somewhere down the valley, a truck rumbled faintly along the highway, a sound that seemed too ordinary for what was happening here. Caleb stayed still. Then, from inside the shed, came a new sound, soft but unmistakable. A little grunt, followed by the scrape of hooves on straw, something shifting upward. Caleb's throat tightened. If the foal was trying to stand, it was a good sign. If it stood and found the udder, it could survive the first critical hours. He leaned forward again, carefully, slowly, barely a movement. Willow tensed instantly, as if she'd felt the change in the air itself. She stepped sideways, blocking everything, her body a dark curtain. Caleb let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding and stared at the shed opening, helpless in the face of a mother's will. By the time Hannah's truck finally turned into the ranch driveway, the sun had climbed high enough to thin the fog, and Caleb had made only one real decision all morning. He wasn't going to force his way into Willow's fear. He walked to meet Hannah at the gate, mud clinging to his boots, and when she stepped out with her medical bag slung over one shoulder, he didn't waste time softening the truth. "She's not letting anyone near," Caleb said, voice rough. "And whatever she's guarding in there, she's guarding it like the world is coming." Hannah didn't walk straight toward the shed when she arrived. She paused beside Caleb at the fence line, letting Willow see her from a distance, letting her scent drift on the damp air before her shape moved any closer. It was a small courtesy, but with animals like Willow, small things carried weight. "Same reaction?" Hannah asked quietly. Caleb nodded. "Worse when the light's up. She hasn't let me see the Foal once." They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching Willow through the thinning fog. The mare's head stayed high, her body angled so that nothing behind her could be glimpsed, not even by accident. It was as deliberate as it was exhausting. Hannah had seen protective mares before, even aggressive ones, but this felt different. There was no bluff in Willow's posture, no warning charge meant to scare and retreat. Every muscle in her body looked prepared for a fight she believed she couldn't afford to lose. Hannah moved a step closer. Willow responded instantly, hooves digging into the straw, neck arching, eyes wide with a fear that bordered on panic. Hannah stopped where she was. "All right," she murmured. "I see it." Caleb exhaled slowly. Part of him had wanted Hannah to walk in and fix this with authority and skill, the way people expected veterinarians to do. Another part, older, quieter, had known it wouldn't be that simple. They didn't try to touch Willow. They didn't try to distract her. Instead, Hannah unpacked her bag near the fence, moving slowly, deliberately, making each action visible. She took out a stethoscope, but didn't put it on. She pulled out gloves and set them aside, unused. Everything about her presence said the same thing. "I'm here, but I'm not taking anything from you." Minutes passed, then more. The ranch settled into an uneasy rhythm. A breeze lifted the fog in uneven strips, revealing patches of blue sky overhead. Sunlight spilled across the yard, but seemed to stop short of the shed, as if even it knew better than to intrude. From inside, a faint sound drifted out, soft, uneven. Not a whinny, not a cry. Something smaller. Hannah stiffened. "Did you hear that?" Caleb nodded. His heart beat faster, not with hope exactly, but with the pressure of uncertainty. The sound came again, a small huff, followed by a pause that stretched just long enough to hurt. "That's breathing," Hannah said, "weak but steady." "Is that good?" Caleb asked. "It's something," she replied, "but it doesn't tell us enough." They waited. Time behaved strangely out there, bending and warping under the weight of not knowing. Caleb watched Willow's flanks rise and fall faster than normal, her breathing still hard hours after birth. Sweat had dried and darkened her coat. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't rested. Every instinct in her was focused on holding the line. At one point, Willow shifted her weight, and for half a second Caleb saw movement behind her. Just a blur of pale straw and a thin, trembling leg that disappeared the instant Willow adjusted her stance. Hannah caught it too. "That leg," she said quietly. "Did you see how it moved?" Caleb nodded, his mouth dry. "It didn't look right." Hannah didn't answer immediately. She watched Willow with renewed intensity, her professional calm hiding calculations that ran fast and deep. There were reasons a mare might behave like this. Pain, trauma, neurological issues. But there were other reasons too, ones Hannah didn't voice yet. They tried again in the... Afternoon, after the air warmed and the ranch grew quieter, Hannah spoke softly as she approached, her voice low and even, words chosen more for tone than meaning. Willow listened, and then stepped forward, cutting the distance in half with a speed that made Caleb's stomach drop. Hannah backed away instantly. "That's our answer," she said under her breath. "If we push her, she's going to explode." "So what do we do?" Caleb asked. Hannah closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was no indecision there, only gravity. "We observe. We don't escalate. Not today." Caleb rubbed his hands together, the chill finally seeping through now that adrenaline was wearing off. "And if the foal hasn't nursed?" Hannah looked at the shed again. "Then we have a problem we can't solve by force." The words landed heavy between them. They set up a chair near the barn wall, far enough back to keep Willow from reacting, close enough to hear. Caleb took the first watch. Hannah stayed longer than she had planned, sitting with him in silence, listening to the soft, intermittent sounds drifting from the shed. They spoke only when necessary. As afternoon slid toward evening, something changed. Willow's stance softened, just barely. She lowered her head once, twice, as if the weight of vigilance was finally starting to pull her down. The foal made another sound, stronger this time, followed by a faint rustle that sounded like movement upward. Caleb leaned forward, careful not to cross the invisible boundary. "Is that—" he started. Hannah nodded slowly. "If it's standing, even briefly, that's a good sign." They didn't celebrate. They didn't move. They just watched and waited as the sun dipped low enough to turn the sky copper and gold. Shadows stretched long across the yard. Somewhere beyond the trees, a raven called, its voice echoing sharp and lonely. Then it happened. For no more than a heartbeat, Willow shifted to adjust her footing. The foal stepped, not fully into view, but enough. Enough for Caleb to see a curve where there shouldn't be one, a fragile angle to a limb that bent under its own weight. Enough for Hannah to inhale sharply and go still. Willow corrected instantly, placing herself back in front of the foal with a protective urgency that felt almost desperate. Caleb's chest tightened. Hannah didn't speak for a long time. Finally she said, "I think she knows." Caleb didn't ask what she meant. He was starting to understand it himself. Whatever was hidden behind Willow wasn't just small. It wasn't just vulnerable. It was wrong, in a way that no amount of care could undo. As dusk settled over the ranch, Hannah gathered her things. "I'll be back in the morning," she said, "earlier, with equipment we can use from a distance." Caleb nodded. "And if it doesn't make it through the night?" Hannah met his eyes. "Then the best thing we can do is make sure it doesn't spend that night afraid." After she left, Caleb stayed where he was, wrapped in a jacket that no longer held warmth. The shed stood quiet against the darkening trees, Willow's silhouette rigid and unyielding inside. For the first time since the whinny in the fog had woken him, Caleb stopped thinking about what he could fix. He started thinking about what Willow was trying to hide, and why she believed hiding it was the only mercy left. Night fell without ceremony. No storm, no wind, just a slow darkening that made the shed seem to retreat deeper into itself. Caleb kept the yard lights off, letting the ranch settle into a hush, broken only by distant water and the soft shifting of animals bedding down. He sat where he had all evening, a few yards from the shed, knees stiff, hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. Inside the shelter, Willow remained standing, her silhouette unwavering, her attention fixed on a world she refused to share. Hannah returned before dawn, headlights low, tires whispering through mud. She parked well away from the shed and joined Caleb without speaking, her breath fogging as she took in the scene. Willow noticed her immediately, posture tightening, head lifting high. Hannah stopped and stayed stopped. The message was clear. This was as close as she would get. They worked from a distance. Hannah unpacked a compact ultrasound unit and a directional microphone, tools meant for wildlife surveys and skittish livestock. Things designed to listen without intruding. She placed them carefully, angling toward the open front of the shed, adjusting sensitivity with slow, deliberate turns. Caleb watched her hands, steady and practiced, and felt the tension in his chest shift from panic to something heavier, anticipation maybe, or dread. The first readings were inconclusive, a flutter of sound, irregular but present. Hannah listened again, her expression neutral, unreadable. "Breathing still there," she said quietly. "Shallow, inconsistent." "Heart?" Caleb asked. Hannah hesitated. "Hard to isolate." They waited. Again. When the foal moved, the sound traveled faintly through the device, scrapes and soft thumps against straw. Willow responded to each movement with subtle adjustments, her body a living barricade. She didn't look at the equipment. She looked at Hannah, at Caleb, at anything that might decide to cross the space she had claimed. Caleb's thoughts drifted to lines, property lines, moral lines, lines people drew when they decided what was acceptable loss and what wasn't. He'd spent years believing that saving animals meant intervention, treatment, decisive action. Now he wasn't so sure. Now the most important line was the one Willow had drawn, and everything in him said crossing it would break something that couldn't be put back together. Hannah straightened and exhaled. "We can sedate her," she said, not as a suggestion but as a fact. "Light dose. Enough to examine the foal, check reflexes, see if there's anything we can address." "And the risks?" Caleb asked, though he already knew. "She could panic as it wears off. She could reject the foal entirely. If she goes down wrong, she could injure it without meaning to." Hannah paused. "And if the foal's condition is what I think it might be, there's nothing to fix." Caleb closed his eyes. The cold crept up through the soles of his boots, but he barely felt it. He thought of the invoices on his kitchen table, the grant application he hadn't finished, the quiet pressure of running a rescue that never quite balanced its books. He thought of donors who wanted outcomes, rescues that ended in happy photos and clean narratives. He thought of the harder stories that didn't fit neatly into fundraising emails. "Could we help it be more comfortable?" he asked, "without touching?" Hannah considered. "We can adjust the environment. Heat. Quiet. Minimize stress." She looked toward Willow. "That part she's already doing." They didn't sedate. They didn't advance. They chose the smallest actions that still mattered. Caleb brought extra straw and slid it toward the entrance, careful not to step closer than Willow allowed. Hannah adjusted the windbreak on the far side of the shed, blocking a draft that funneled cold air inside. They kept their voices low, movements predictable. They became fixtures instead of threats. As the morning wore on, Willow's breathing slowed, not relaxed, never relaxed, but less frantic. The foal's movements came in shorter bursts now, followed by long pauses. Each pause stretched Caleb's nerves taut, then released them with the next faint sound. At midday, a shaft of light angled across the yard and brushed the shed's threshold. Willow shifted instinctively, turning her body to cast deeper shadow where the foal lay. The precision of it caught Caleb off guard. This wasn't random fear. This was intent. Hannah noticed too. "She's managing light," she murmured, "keeping it dim." "Why would she?" Caleb began, then stopped. The answer hovered just out of reach, unsettling and quiet. They stayed until afternoon, then evening again. No dramatic change, no sudden crisis, just a slow narrowing of options. Hannah packed up with care, as if loud movements might crack the fragile truce they'd established. "I'll check in by phone tonight," she said. "If anything shifts, anything at all, you call me. Otherwise, We keep doing this." She gestured to the space between them and the shed. "We stay on our side of the line." After she left, Caleb remained. He listened to the ranch breathe, to the soft, uneven rhythm inside the shelter. He thought about all the times he'd believed persistence meant pushing harder and how often that belief had failed him. Here, persistence meant restraint. As dusk settled, Willow lowered her head for the first time and rested her muzzle against the straw. Not sleeping, never sleeping, but allowing her weight to shift, allowing fatigue to show. The foal stirred weakly, a small sound escaping into the quiet. Willow responded at once, lifting her head, reasserting the barrier. Caleb didn't move. He understood now that whatever came next wouldn't be decided by tools or timing. It would be decided by whether they respected the line Willow had drawn, and whether love in this place meant action or the courage to stand back. Morning arrived without relief. The light crept in, pale and cautious, as if it, too, had learned not to rush this place. Caleb stood from the chair he had slept in badly, joints stiff, head heavy, and stretched just enough to wake his circulation without drawing attention. The shed looked unchanged, but the air felt different, thinner somehow, pulled taut by waiting. Willow remained upright. She had not lain down. Her posture told a story of endurance more than strength now, shoulders set, legs braced, eyes scanning the narrow slice of world she allowed herself to see. When the foal shifted, Willow shifted with it, her body recalibrating to keep the same small geography of shadow intact. Caleb noticed the pattern, how she positioned herself between the foal and sound, between the foal and light, between the foal and any shape that might be interpreted as intent. He counted the hours by small mercies. The foal made noise twice before noon, soft, breathy sounds that suggested consciousness, if not comfort. Willow drank when Caleb slid a bucket close enough to be accepted. She did not eat. Hunger had been outranked by something older. Caleb busied himself with tasks that kept him near, but not intrusive. He checked fences, mended a loose hinge, recorded notes for donors he hadn't yet answered. Ranch insurance crossed his mind. Liability, coverage limits, the way policies talked about loss, as if it were a number you could circle. He pushed the thought away. There would be time for spreadsheets and forms later, time for the practical language of animal welfare and veterinary care. For now, there was only watchfulness. In the afternoon, clouds thickened, dulling the sun and cooling the air. Willow responded by easing her stance a fraction, shifting to allow deeper shade where the foal lay. The foal tried to rise. The sound was unmistakable, a scrape, a wobble, a breath pulled in too fast. Caleb leaned forward, heart lifting and sinking all at once. Willow blocked him before he realized he'd moved. He stopped instantly, palms open, gaze lowered. The mare's eyes softened only after he retreated. Caleb felt a sting of shame, not for wanting to help, but for forgetting, even briefly, that help had rules here. Hannah called just after 3. Caleb kept his voice low as he described what he'd heard, what he hadn't seen. Hannah asked questions designed to narrow margins, duration of movement, intervals between sounds, changes in Willow's behavior. When the call ended, Caleb felt no closer to an answer, only more aware of how narrow the path had become. As evening approached, something subtle changed. Willow's vigilance took on a different shape. It wasn't less, it was focused. She adjusted with purpose, angling herself so the foal's head, still hidden, stayed close to her chest. The foal's breathing grew shallow, then steadied. Caleb noticed Willow lower her muzzle, touching the straw near where the foal lay, a gesture so gentle it made his throat tighten. He realized then that Willow wasn't just guarding against intrusion. She was managing time. Night settled again, cool and quiet. Caleb kept his distance, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of hay. He didn't count minutes anymore. He listened for signs and learned to accept their absence. Once the foal went silent long enough that Caleb stood, ready to move, before a small exhale returned the world to its axis. Sometime after midnight, Willow's head dipped and stayed there. Not sleep, never sleep, but a concession. The foal shifted closer to her warmth. The sound that followed wasn't a cry. It was a sigh. Caleb didn't approach. He didn't whisper encouragement. He didn't try to document the moment with a phone that would have felt like an intrusion. He stayed where he was and let the hours pass, understanding now that the longest days weren't measured by clocks. They were measured by restraint, by the discipline of staying back when everything in you wanted to step forward. When dawn returned, thin and gray, Caleb knew the waiting hadn't ended. It had changed. And whatever the next day would bring, it would ask something different of them all. The sky cleared sometime mid-morning, not all at once, but in thin, deliberate breaks. Sunlight slipped through the cloud cover in narrow bands, bright enough to warm the mud, but gentle enough to feel earned. Caleb noticed it first by the way the air shifted. Less damp, more open, like a held breath being released. Willow noticed it too. She adjusted immediately, stepping sideways with a precision that had nothing to do with fatigue. Her body angled to keep the deepest shadow pooled behind her chest and forelegs. Caleb watched the movement with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just guarding space. This was strategy. He stayed where he was, near the barn wall, his presence now a familiar shape in Willow's peripheral vision. The ranch carried on around them. Feed deliveries came and went at the gate. A volunteer texted to ask if help was needed. Caleb replied with a simple, "Not yet." There were moments when animal rescue required many hands. This was not one of them. The foal stirred. It wasn't the tentative movement from before. This time there was weight behind it, intention. Straw shifted audibly, and Willow's head snapped down, her muzzle hovering close to the ground. She didn't nudge the foal forward. She didn't pull it back. She waited. Caleb leaned forward an inch, no more. He told himself he was just listening, but the truth was he needed to know. The foal rose, not cleanly, not confidently. One foreleg straightened, while the other lagged behind, trembling. A hind leg followed with a delay that felt too long. The small body wobbled, corrected, wobbled again. Caleb's chest tightened as the foal took a half step, just enough to shift out of perfect concealment. Light touched it. Not fully. Not dramatically. Just a sliver across the shoulder and neck. It was enough. Caleb saw the way the skin stretched too thin over bone, the way the joint bent inward at an angle that made no anatomical sense. He saw how the foal's head tilted slightly, not with curiosity, but with effort. One eye caught the light and didn't respond the way it should have, blinking late, unfocused. The foal froze, as if aware it had crossed some invisible threshold. Willow moved instantly. She stepped forward, broad and decisive, placing her body between the foal and the light with a force that carried no anger, only urgency. The foal lost its balance and folded back into the straw. Willow lowered her head, not to scold, not to push, but to shield. Caleb didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until his lungs burned. Hannah's words from the day before echoed in his mind. There's nothing to fix. He understood now what she'd been careful not to say outright. This wasn't a matter of delayed development or temporary weakness. This was something written deep, something that care and money and even the best veterinary care couldn't erase. Caleb thought of the articles he'd read over the years, the ones donors liked to share, stories of miraculous recoveries, advanced treatments, cutting-edge veterinary care that turned dire cases around. He believed in those stories. He'd seen them happen. But he'd also learned, quietly, that for every miracle, There were a dozen truths no one wanted to read. Willow stood over the foal, her sides heaving. She shifted again, angling so the shadow deepened, so the light couldn't find the fragile angles of that small body. Caleb saw it clearly now. She wasn't afraid of him or Hannah or the ranch. She was afraid of what the world would do to her child if it were fully seen. Hannah arrived shortly after noon. She stopped beside Caleb and followed his gaze. He didn't need to explain. The silence between them held the explanation well enough. "I saw it," she said softly. Caleb nodded once. Hannah didn't move closer. She didn't reach for her bag. She watched Willow reposition herself with each shift of the sun, managing shadow like a living architecture. "That kind of deformity," Hannah said after a moment, choosing her words carefully, "often comes with others, internal ones. Even if we could stabilize the leg, there's no guarantee of comfort or awareness." Caleb swallowed. "How long?" Hannah didn't answer right away. She listened to the sounds drifting from the shed, measured the spaces between them. "Hours," she said. "Maybe a day. Hard to know." Caleb looked at Willow, at the way her ears flicked constantly, tracking sound, light, intent. "She knows," he said. It wasn't a question. Hannah nodded. Mares like her, prey animals, don't think in timelines. They think in outcomes. She knows this foal won't outrun danger. She knows it won't tolerate exposure, so she's doing the only thing she can. "Buying time," Caleb said. "Creating safety," Hannah corrected gently. They stood together as the afternoon wore on. Caleb made small adjustments, hung a tarp on the far fence to block reflected light, dampened noise by closing unused gates. It wasn't treatment. It was accommodation, the kind often overlooked because it didn't come with invoices or guarantees. As evening approached, the foal attempted to rise again. This time it managed only a partial lift before sinking back down. The effort left it breathing fast, shallow. Willow lowered herself just enough to bring her warmth closer, her head bent protectively. Caleb felt something settle inside him then. Not resignation, but clarity. There would be no dramatic intervention, no late-night emergency surgery billed to ranch insurance, no triumphant outcome to photograph for donors. What there would be was presence, restraint, and a mother who refused to let the world be cruel before it had to be. The sun slipped lower, the light thinning again. Shadows returned to their rightful places. Willow relaxed a fraction, her work for the day complete. Caleb stayed where he was, knowing now that seeing had changed everything, and that from this point on, helping meant honoring what had been revealed, not trying to undo it. By late afternoon, the ranch felt suspended in a quieter version of itself, as though the land had learned the rules Willow was enforcing. Sound softened, movement slowed. Even the other horses seemed subdued, their usual restlessness replaced by an uneasy calm that carried across the paddocks. Caleb noticed it when a gelding near the fence chose not to call out, lowering his head instead, ears angled toward the shed. Inside the shelter, Willow's vigilance never wavered, but it changed texture. It was no longer sharp with panic. It had become dense, layered with intent. She no longer reacted to every distant sound or subtle shift. Instead, she focused inward, her attention narrowing to the small, fragile life pressed close to her chest. The foal breathed in shallow rhythms now, each rise of its ribs visible only when Caleb looked long enough to separate movement from shadow. It did not try to stand again. It conserved what little strength it had, instinctively mirroring its mother's stillness. Willow adjusted herself to accommodate that need, lowering her body just enough to provide warmth without crushing, lifting her head whenever the foal stirred, as if checking that the world had not changed in the seconds she wasn't watching. Caleb sat on the ground this time, not the chair. He wanted to be lower, smaller, easier to ignore. His knees protested, but he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him present. It kept him from drifting into plans and contingencies that no longer applied. Hannah returned briefly before dusk, not with equipment, but with quiet. She stood beside Caleb, hands tucked into her jacket, eyes steady on Willow. "She's not waiting for us," Hannah said softly. "She's already decided what this time is for." Caleb nodded. "She's not asking us to save it." "No," Hannah agreed. "She's asking us not to make it harder." They spoke then in low voices about things that rarely made it into case notes or training manuals. About how prey animals understood vulnerability in a way humans rarely did. About how a mother could sense limits long before tests or scans confirmed them. About how mercy sometimes arrived disguised as defiance. Hannah didn't stay long. There was nothing more to monitor, nothing more to measure. She left her number on the barn desk again, not because Caleb needed it, but because the ritual mattered. Then she drove away slowly, as if the road itself required gentleness. As evening deepened, Willow shifted her weight and lowered herself further, careful, controlled. The foal nestled into the curve of her body, its small head resting against her shoulder. Caleb watched the movement with a tightness in his chest that felt both painful and reverent. There was no confusion in Willow's actions, no hesitation. She was doing exactly what she believed she was meant to do. The sky turned amber, then gray. Shadows thickened. Caleb noticed that Willow stopped tracking the light altogether. She no longer needed to. The shed held darkness now, complete and protective. At one point the foal made a faint sound, barely more than air passing through a narrow space. Willow responded instantly, lowering her muzzle to the straw near its head, breathing slow and steady, offering rhythm where there was little strength left to maintain one. Caleb felt his eyes burn and looked away, fixing his gaze on the fence line, the trees, anything solid enough to hold him. He understood now what had unsettled him from the beginning. Willow's aggression had never been about fear of loss. It had been about certainty. She had recognized the truth the moment her foal entered the world, fragile and imperfect, and she had acted accordingly. Not with cruelty, not with rejection. With protection measured in minutes and inches and shadow. Night returned quietly. Caleb stayed. He did not check his phone. He did not write notes. He did not think about donor updates or insurance claims or the language of animal welfare that demanded outcomes. He thought only of what it meant to witness something without trying to reshape it. Inside the shed, Willow remained still, her breathing slow. Her body curved around the foal like a final shelter. The world beyond the ranch continued as it always did. Cars on distant roads, lights in houses, people eating dinner and talking about tomorrow. Here, time had narrowed to something smaller. Caleb stayed with it, understanding that the greatest act of care he could offer now was not intervention, but acknowledgement of a mother who already knew and a life that would never need to face the world alone. Sometime before dawn, the air shifted again, not with weather, but with finality. Caleb sensed it before he understood it, the way a room feels different after a conversation has ended, even if no one says goodbye. He straightened from where he sat on the ground, joints protesting, and listened past the ordinary sounds of night. Inside the shed, Willow's breathing had slowed to a careful, deliberate rhythm. Each exhale seemed measured, as if she were counting something no one else could see. The foal did not move, not with effort, not with curiosity, only with the faint rise and fall that marked the thin boundary between presence and absence. Caleb did not approach. He adjusted the tarp at the far fence to keep reflected light from sneaking in as dawn crept closer. He closed a gate that squeaked when the wind touched it. He made coffee and forgot to drink it. These small acts felt necessary, like setting a table even when you know the meal will be brief. The sky lightened to a washed-out gray. Birds called, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Willow lifted her head once, ears flicking toward the sound, then lowered it again, returning her attention to the space beneath her chest. Caleb noticed her muscles tremble, not with fear, but with effort. Holding still for this long took strength. The foal's breathing grew shallower. Caleb recognized the change without needing to see it. He'd heard it before, in old dogs and injured horses, in moments when care had reached its limit, and presence became the only remaining gift. He stayed where he was, hands flat on the earth, grounding himself in the cold. A volunteer's truck slowed at the gate and stopped. Caleb raised a hand before it could turn in. The driver hesitated, then nodded and pulled away. There would be explanations later. For now, the quiet mattered. Inside the shed, Willow shifted slightly, adjusting her weight so the foal's head rested more securely against her shoulder. She lowered her muzzle and breathed into the straw, slow and even, offering rhythm when the foal could no longer find one on its own. The foal's chest rose once more, then again, each breath a smaller thing than the last. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He did not pray. He did not bargain. He simply stayed. When it happened, there was no sound to mark it, no dramatic moment, no signal that demanded attention. The foal's breathing paused, resumed briefly, then stopped altogether. The stillness that followed was different from the quiet before. Settled. Unambiguous. Willow knew. She did not startle. She did not call out. She remained exactly where she was, head lowered, body curved protectively around a life that had just slipped beyond reach. Minutes passed. Caleb counted them without meaning to, not because the number mattered, but because it gave his mind something to hold while his chest ached. Eventually, Willow lifted her head and inhaled deeply. She nudged the foal once, gently, then again, as if confirming what she already understood. When there was no response, she stilled. Her ears rotated backward, then forward, listening not for movement, but for the world itself. Caleb remained outside the invisible boundary. He did not step closer to check a pulse. He did not call Hannah. Those things could wait. This moment belonged to Willow. Time stretched. The sun rose higher, warming the mud, lighting the edges of the shed. Willow shifted at last, standing fully. For a brief, terrible second, Caleb thought she might move away, but she did not. She stood over the foal, blocking the light as she always had, even now. When Hannah arrived later that morning, Caleb met her at the gate. He didn't need to say much. She read it in his posture, in the way the ranch felt subdued, as if it were holding its breath out of respect. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. It was peaceful. Hannah didn't rush to the shed. She waited until Willow stepped back on her own, until the mare allowed space without being asked. Only then did Hannah approach, movement slow, voice low. She confirmed what they already knew with gentle hands and practiced calm. Willow watched, tense but no longer hostile. When Hannah finished, she stepped away immediately, returning the space without comment. Willow lowered her head again, breathing in the familiar scent of straw and earth and loss. Caleb stood nearby, not intruding, not retreating. He felt the weight of the past days settle into something quieter. Grief, yes, but also a strange gratitude. There had been no struggle at the end, no fear, no isolation. What Willow had guarded was not life at all costs. It was dignity. And in that, Caleb realized, nothing had gone wrong. The work that followed did not announce itself as work. It arrived quietly, wrapped in ordinary motions that felt unfamiliar now, as if Caleb were performing tasks someone else had taught him long ago. He opened gates. He checked water. He swept the aisle of the barn where straw had scattered during the night. Each movement carried the same care he had practiced for days, slow, predictable, respectful of space. Willow remained in the shed. She did not stand guard anymore. She stood presence. Her posture had softened, the rigid line of her neck easing into something heavier, more inward. She did not pin her ears when Caleb passed at a distance. She watched him without urgency, eyes dark and reflective, as if the world had shifted and she was learning its new shape. Hannah stayed only as long as she needed to. She spoke little, her words functional and spare. There would be no tests, no paperwork beyond what was required. She left the space intact, untouched by procedures that would have served no purpose now. Before she went, she paused beside Caleb, her hand resting briefly on his sleeve. "You did right by her," she said. Caleb nodded, though the words landed slowly. Right felt like too simple a measure for something that had cost this much. As the morning wore on, the ranch began to reclaim its rhythm. A delivery truck arrived with feed. Caleb signed the invoice and caught himself staring at the total longer than necessary. Numbers still mattered. The rescue still needed money, insurance, sustainability. Life did not pause out of courtesy. But the way he carried those concerns had changed. They no longer pressed from the front. They waited. He returned to the shed only when Willow stepped aside on her own. The foal lay where it had been, small and still, its outline softened by straw and shadow. Caleb did not kneel. He did not reach out. He stood just inside the threshold and let the sight settle without judgment. This was not a failure to document. It was a choice not to intrude on what had already been witnessed enough. Willow approached the foal once more, nudged it gently, then turned away. She moved to the far corner of the shed and stood there, head lowered, breathing slow. The gesture was unmistakable. The vigil was over. Caleb waited until Willow exited the shed and walked toward the paddock, her steps measured but steady. Only then did he call the one volunteer he trusted to understand restraint as care. Together they handled what needed to be done with quiet efficiency, voices low, movements careful, leaving the space as it had been found. By afternoon the shed was empty. Caleb sat on the fence rail and watched Willow graze. She ate slowly, methodically, as if relearning hunger. The act seemed to ground her, tethering her back to a body that had been all vigilance and sacrifice. Other horses drifted closer, drawn by instinct, offering the quiet companionship of proximity without demand. A message arrived on Caleb's phone from a donor asking for updates. He stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. He typed a response, erased it, then typed again. The language he usually relied on, hopeful, reassuring, outcome-driven, felt wrong. He chose honesty instead, tempered with care. "We lost the foal. The mare protected it until the end. It was peaceful." He sent the message and set the phone down. Later he found himself back at the barn desk, the whiteboard unchanged. He added a single note beneath the others, small and unassuming. Trust matters. He wasn't sure why he wrote it. Perhaps because some lessons needed to exist outside the body to be believed. As evening came, Caleb walked the perimeter of the ranch, checking fences, closing gates. The valley glowed with late light, the mountains holding steady against the sky. Life, stubborn and unembarrassed, continued everywhere he looked. When he returned, Willow stood at the fence line, watching him. He stopped a few feet away and waited. After a moment, she stepped closer. Not all the way, not seeking contact, but acknowledging presence. Caleb stayed still. He didn't reach for her. He let the distance remain what it was. They stood there together as the light faded, two survivors of the same quiet ordeal. Caleb understood now that the story would not end with recovery or redemption in the way people like to hear it. There would be no lesson packaged neatly for comfort. What remained was simpler and harder, the knowledge that care sometimes meant stepping back, that love could look like refusal, and that dignity was a form of shelter no one could build for another being. Only protect. As darkness settled, Caleb turned toward the barn lights and switched them on, one by one. The ranch exhaled into night, and Willow, no longer guarding shadows, lifted her head to the open sky. In the days that followed, the ranch returned to its ordinary noises, but Caleb noticed how different they sounded now. Gates still creaked, buckets still clanged, horses still called out across the paddocks at feeding time. Yet beneath those familiar sounds was a steadiness that hadn't been there before, as if something fragile had been set down carefully and left undisturbed. Willow changed in small, unmistakable ways. She moved more freely through the pasture, her stride unguarded, her head carried lower. She allowed other horses to stand near her without tension, accepting their quiet company without needing to control it. When Caleb passed along the fence, she no longer tracked his movement with sharp vigilance. Instead, she acknowledged him with a glance and returned to grazing, secure in a world that no longer required constant defense. Caleb found himself thinking less about outcomes and more about thresholds. The moments when pushing forward caused harm, and the rarer moments when stepping back became the truest form of care. He caught himself adjusting routines accordingly, not just with Willow, but with the rest of the animals under his watch. He lingered longer before intervening. He listened more. He trusted what he saw instead of what he hoped for. One afternoon, a potential donor visited the ranch. The man walked the fences, asked about cost, about success rates, about the kinds of stories that traveled well online. Caleb answered honestly, but without embellishment. When the man asked about Willow, Caleb told him the truth, briefly, plainly. There was a pause afterward, the kind that usually demanded reassurance. Instead, the man nodded. "Sounds like she wasn't alone," he said. Caleb watched him leave, unsure whether support would follow, and realized that for once it didn't matter. The ranch would continue the way it always had, through careful budgeting, community, help, and the quiet conviction that not every valuable thing could be measured. As spring deepened into warmer days, Caleb repaired the shed where Willow had stood her vigil. He replaced a warped board, reinforced a beam, spread fresh straw. He didn't rush the work. He didn't rename the space or mark it in any way. Some places didn't need memorials to be remembered. On an evening washed in gold, Caleb leaned against the fence and watched Willow at the far edge of the pasture. She lifted her head, ears forward, and met his gaze. For a moment neither moved. There was no demand in the look, no question, no warning, just recognition. Caleb raised a hand in a small, instinctive gesture. Willow turned back to the grass. He understood then that what had happened on the ranch would never be a story he told to convince anyone of anything. It wasn't proof of resilience or a lesson in loss dressed up for comfort. It was simply an account of what care looked like when there was nothing left to fix, when dignity became the last shelter and presence the final gift. The mountains held steady against the sky. The valley breathed. The ranch lights came on at dusk, one by one, and life continued, not unchanged, but informed. And in that quiet continuation, Caleb knew exactly what Willow had been protecting all along. Not a future, not a miracle, just the right to be held until the end. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an animal's love that changed the way you see the world? Your words matter here. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, please like this video and subscribe. More true stories are waiting, quiet, powerful, and worth your time.